The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Lunch and Learn series. This is Unit 2, and I just wanted to do a sound check. So could I ask you, please, over in the question box on the right-hand side, if you could just type in the word clear. That lets me know that I'm being heard and I'm not speaking to myself, which isn't a good thing. So thanks, John. Thanks, Brendan. Thanks, Saren. Okay. Thanks, Sue. Thanks, Graham. Okay, sounds like I'm coming across loud and clear, which is great. So I hope you've had a chance to complete the influencing capabilities profile, but if you haven't, no problem. You can still get a chance to do that at the conclusion of today. But essentially what I'm attempting to do today is to explain to you, or pretty much give you a debrief, if you like, of the influencing capabilities profile. So that's essentially what we're doing today. Thanks, Dan. So let's move on. You can see, or will see very shortly, coming up on your screen, we have here the program in its entirety, and you'll notice that we're up to, of course, Unit 2, which is enhancing your personal influence at the executive level. And of course, last time we met, we looked at strategically managing performance. So that's where we're up to in the process. So let's move on to enhancing our personal influence at the executive level. Now, I designed this influencing capabilities profile as part of a book I wrote in 2015 entitled The New Influencing Toolkit. My whole purpose of that is that when I went out and I looked at what was available, I found that at one end of the spectrum, which let's say the academics side of things, the material wasn't really practical. It couldn't be used in a practical sense. At the other end of the continuum, we had a lot of sales type material, you know, on retail selling and smile training and that kind of thing. And that wasn't really applicable either. So I kind of thought, well, maybe there's an opportunity, maybe there's a gap in the market there for some influencing capabilities profile, which really assists leaders to develop their ability to influence other people. So essentially that was the rationale or the reason for me to do what I did. So that's where it all came from initially. So let's get stuck into it. So today I'm going to talk about what influence actually is. And I think when we use the word influence, it brings up all sorts of images of manipulation and being cunning and underhanded and the whole range of things. It's anything but that, certainly in my case at least, although I don't doubt for a minute that someone being very manipulative can also be very influential. This is not what I'm on about today. I'm going to give you a debrief, as I mentioned earlier, on the influencing capabilities framework, let you see how it works. And if you've got your profile in front of you, of course, it would be very useful because you can then start looking at your own scores in relation to some of the descriptors that I give you. Essentially, the profile looks at 4 influencing strategies, and if you've done the profile, you would have had a score for the 4 influencing strategies. And I'm going to talk about each of those 4. But really what I want to emphasize here is that if you want to improve your ability to influence, which I'm sure you do, then the idea is to use all 4, although your blind spot is probably the one where you've got the highest score. In other words, what's happening is you're using it probably when you should be reverting to another influencing strategy. But also your highest score indicates your strength, so you're probably using that quite well in the right circumstances with the right people. I'm going to share with you a number of influencing tools that you can use as well, very practical tools that you can use at an executive level. Now, in the book, I've got 64 tools that you can go through, and certainly if you'd like a copy of that, let me know. But essentially, I've whittled it down to about 12 tools, and these are the tools that I think you could use pretty much straight away, and you may well be using them anyway, which is fine. So I'd encourage you to ask questions. I encourage you, as usual, to make statements, and by all means do that. Remember, when you type in a statement in there in the question box, what happens is that I'm the only person that gets to see that statement, and I'll just simply read it out and respond to it when I see a statement come up. All right, now the influencing capabilities profile, I have selected 4 people, historical figures if you like, who pretty much, well, I'll ask you the question actually, and I'd like you to type in the answer. What do you think these 4, and we'll call them leaders because they are, I can say to you that one's still alive, 3 are dead, but what would you say that they've all got in common? Could I just get some responses from you? Just type in over on the question box, what do you think these 4 characters have in common? Now, some of them I think you would recognise immediately. Hopefully you recognise them all, they're historical characters. But just type in, what have they all got in common, these 4 characters? Could I just get some responses there, and we'll have a look at that before we move any further. Okay, so someone says that they're all influential. That's very true. Yes, absolutely. Seren says a high level of influence and known for this all over the world. Absolutely, says Seren. Very strong purpose, says Dan. A great belief in their own beliefs, says John. Ability to motivate, says Graham. Passion for beliefs. Visionary, says Brendan. Passion for beliefs, says Sue. All of those things are actually correct. And these 4 people that you can see in front of you are actually highly influential, and they have been highly influential. They're also highly controversial. Now, I haven't selected them because they happen to be great heroes necessarily of mine, but I've selected them because they are influential, and of course I've tried to be politically correct as well. So I've got 2 males, 2 females. I've got political views from the right wing to the left wing here as well. So I've tried to round it out, but clearly when you look at these 4 characters, you'd have a certain point of view about them, and you may like them or dislike them. They might create a very warm feeling in you or not so. But putting aside all of that, there's no question that they've all been highly influential in their own sphere of influence. They're also highly controversial. So putting that aside, we really want to use them as exemplars to talk about influence. So I'm going to go through each of them and just explain who they are. So if we start clockwise up in the top left-hand corner, we've got Al Gore, who was former Vice President of the United States under the Clinton administration. And after the 2000 election, which he controversially lost to George W. Bush through the Florida election debacle, in fact that was sorted out in the courtroom, he reinvented himself and became a climate change activist. And he wrote a really, he produced a video called The Inconvenient Truth, which really did bring to the consciousness of a lot of people the need for us to do something about climate change. The next person on the list going clockwise is Dr. Martin Luther King. Now, Luther King was assassinated in 1968 along with Bobby Kennedy. But in 1965, he gave one of the greatest speeches of all time, I Have a Dream. And you can actually get to see that on YouTube or even in your electronic copy of your report. If you click on that little icon up on the top right-hand corner, you will get a little glimpse of each of these characters or each of these leaders in action. The next person on the list is the first female Prime Minister of Great Britain, Margaret Thatcher, who was Prime Minister of Great Britain for 10 years. And she pretty much divided a nation. People were either for her or against her. And on her death, there were many people who were dancing in the streets celebrating, but equally there were plenty of remorseful people as well. She certainly knew how to divide people, but there's no question about her capacity to influence. And she changed the landscape of Great Britain during her reign of 10 years. And the last person on the list is Mother Teresa. Now, Mother Teresa was anointed a saint by the Catholic Church a year or 2 ago for her work that she did in the streets of Calcutta and other parts of the world, looking after the destitute and the poor. And she was able to marshal enormous support and voluntary aid to many of these causes of people who are poverty-stricken in these very poor parts of the world. So each of them has enormous influence. There's no question, as many of you said, and I'll use them as examples as we go through the session this morning, so you can see some examples of how they might influence people. Okay, now the first thing I want to do is define what we mean by influence. Now, you know, there's myriad definitions there about what influence is, and you can go and look at them at your leisure. But essentially, this is my definition of influence. And my definition of influence is simply this. It's the power to make other people agree with your opinions or get them to do what you want willingly or ethically. Now, a couple of key words in there. Yes, influence is based on power, no question about that. And the two dimensions are either getting people to do something that you want, so obviously as an executive that would be very applicable for you, but also it may entail getting people to change their point of view or their opinion, so it's getting people to change their thinking. So it can be either of those two things, but nevertheless, it's about doing it in a willing and ethical way. In other words, you're doing it because they want to be influenced. In other words, they know what you're doing and they're quite happy to be influenced that way. And you're doing it in an ethical way. In other words, not in an underhanded way. You're doing it in a transparent way. So you can see that my definition is based on the premise that it's an ethical pursuit to actually influence other people. It's not about manipulation or cunning or being underhanded or anything like that, as I mentioned earlier on in the presentation. So I think it's important that we also acknowledge that all of us, me, you, everybody else, is actually in the business of influence. So being an executive leader, obviously you are in the business of influence. You're trying to influence lots of people in different ways and means. You're trying to influence your boss. You're trying to influence your team. At home, you're trying to influence your partner. If you've got kids, you're trying to influence them. So we spend our life trying to influence other people. So we're either being influenced by other people or we're attempting to influence people. So I just want to make it clear that we're all in that business. And that's one of the reasons, of course, that this is one of the units in the Lunch and Learn series, because it's such a vitally important topic. And obviously some people are better at it than others, no question. But what I'm hoping that you get out of this is an opportunity to start to broaden your influencing capacity to be even more effective than you currently are. And what that actually means is for you to use a variety of different approaches depending on the person or the situation that you're in. And those are the two variables that I'd like to look at next. So there are three variables in influence if you think about it. Now, if you've completed your profile, you have got your preferred style and approach. So it's given you some scores around the, around the profile, and your highest score, of course, is your preferred style and approach. And I'll go into looking at the model shortly. So you've got your own style and approach. So obviously what you do subconsciously, of course, is that you influence people based on your own preferred style and approach. So for example, if you are a very structured person who believe in logic and fact and structure and those kinds of things, then that's of course how you're going to try and influence other people, because you feel comfortable with that. And in fact, that's the way you like to be influenced. So you're probably trying to do that with other people. But there are two other variables that are important here. One of them is that the person or persons that you're trying to influence. So the person or persons that you're trying to influence also have a profile. They may not have completed the influencing capabilities profile, but nevertheless, they have a profile. And so and of course, we've all been in the situation where we've tried to influence somebody and the glaze goes in their eyes and it's obvious you're getting nowhere. In those sorts of circumstances, what we tend to do is to try even harder to influence those people using our preferred style, when in fact what we should stop and think about trying a plan B or a plan C or even a plan D. And of course, the third element in all of this is the context. Certain situations require certain responses. So as an executive, there is time and a place for you to collaborate with your team and have everybody on board. And there's other times where you've got to make a unilateral decision, and you may not have the luxury, for example, of having the time to consult other people. So, of course, when we're influencing people, we don't sit there and think, oh, what's my style? What's their style? What's the situation? Usually we're in the heat of the battle. We don't have time to do that. And so what I'm suggesting here from a very practical point of view is if plan A doesn't work, you try plan B or try plan C. So in other words, what I'm hoping to do here this morning in this short, sharp session is give you some opportunities and scope to exercise a different form of influence if the form of influence that you're using is not working. That's essentially what the message is out of today's webinar. All right, this will come up on your screen very shortly, and if you've got any questions, statements, comments, please, happy to hear those at this stage. But while you might be thinking about that, and this is up on your screen now, you'll notice that my model is pretty straightforward. It's a typical 2x2 matrix. And what you'll notice is that there's two dimensions. There's the push and pull style at the top of the table, and over on the left-hand side, you've got logical and emotional approaches. So let's have a look at push and pull to start with. So let's just understand what we mean by push and pull. They're fairly familiar terms that are used in the literature around influence, but people who like to push are people who have a tendency to drive, push their point home. They make proposals, they convey information. They'll tend to block out information that might not necessarily be information that's favourable to what they're trying to influence other people on. And they will usually take the idea to the person. So if you have a look at your scores on your profile around push and pull, the ideal score would actually be a fairly even score between push and pull. So in other words, what that means is that given in different situations, you're quite comfortable to use one of the two styles. The pull style, on the other hand, is an enabling style. It's testing understanding. It's more collaborative. It's taking people with you. It's seeking out information. It's building and opening up possibilities. It's getting people to come to the idea in their own way, shape or form. So you can see they're quite different styles. Now, on the other hand, if your scores are fairly, there's a fair distinction between the two scores, that would probably suggest that people are aware of your particular style and they will accommodate that style when they're trying to influence you, interestingly enough. So they will know whether you adopt a push or a pull style. They may not use those words, but they know it. Now, the other dimension in the profile, of course, is the approach. So I'll just put this up on the screen for you right now, and you'll notice that over on the left-hand side, you've got a logical approach, which is based on facts, using evidence, rationale, using structure and measurement. So being very systematic and clinical in putting together some data to make your point. But of course, there's another form of influence, and that is the emotional approach, where you may use values and feelings and perceptions, and you're probably a little more flexible, and you're interested in building morale up as a key point when you're working with your teams. Now, of course, you have a looking at your scores. I mean, if you've got a strong bias towards a logical approach, then it'll be fairly obvious to you. It'll be no surprise. And it'll be no surprise, interesting enough, to anybody else that you work with. In other words, they know how you like to operate. And equally, if you've got a very strong score in your emotional approach, it probably suggests that people are aware of that as well. Now, one's not necessarily better than the other, but it's fair to say that in a local government environment, we've probably got a predisposition towards a logical approach because it's a public entity. It's run by a board, which is a series of councillors, and the public are expecting that decisions are based on a rational approach. But nevertheless, I can guarantee to you there'll be people inside your organisation who would adopt an emotional approach to influence. So when you extrapolate all that, what you end up with is 4 different influencing strategies. Investigation, which is a logical push approach. Motivation, which is an emotional push approach. You've got a calculation strategy, which is a pull style using a logical approach. And you've got a collaboration strategy, which is a pull style using an emotional approach. So that brings you to your preferred strategy that you like to use most of the time. Now, again, if your scores are fairly even in those four quadrants, that probably suggests that you're reasonably flexible in terms of how you go about your process of influence. But if there's a strong bias towards one or the other, then it's probably likely that that's a great strength of yours, but it could also be a weakness in the sense that when you're trying to influence certain types of people who may not have that, who may not share that influencing strategy, you might find it very difficult to get your point across. So it's about awareness, of course. So that's the model, and that's how the model is actually constructed. And within those four influencing strategies, investigation, calculation, motivation, and collaboration, underpinning those four are some particular capabilities. And coming up on your screen very shortly, you will see this isn't my profile, incidentally, if you're wondering, but it is somebody's profile. I've taken the name off it, but it just gives you an indication of what that looks like. Now, that's a very valuable page in your report because you can see that the scores have all been, they've been put down. And so if I'm working with this person, for example, I might be suggesting to them not to overuse gathering evidence. You'll notice they've got a score of 83 points there. So they've got a very strong predisposition. In fact, they are an engineer, very strong predisposition towards that. And of course, that's their professional approach, of course. That's how they do things. But of course, if you're working with someone who has a very strong emotional approach, who perhaps prefers a more collaborative style, then that's probably not likely to work. So I would probably say be careful with that. But if you have a look down at the bottom left-hand corner, you can see that connecting emotionally, there's 40% there, and up in the top right-hand corner, offering concessions, there's 33% there. So these would be the areas that I'd be suggesting to this person, and have done so, that they might start to try to build those capabilities up in the interest of becoming even more influential in certain circumstances as such. So, have a look at your scores and your ratings, and that could be quite interesting. We've just got, here we go. Dan says, I'm 85%, not surprising. So that, I'm assuming, Dan, what you're talking about there is investigation. So what that means is that put in the right situation where you're required to investigate, you're absolutely in your element, and probably the nature of the work that you do, knowing you, it's probably quite reasonable. Trouble is, of course, you also may overuse that at certain times. Saren says, for people that work by standards every day, how would you rank higher in offering concessions? I think when I talk about, it's a good question, Saren, when I talk about concessions, I'm actually talking about, you scratch my back, I scratch yours. So it's about a bit of toing and froing, if you like, so that by giving people some type of concession, you can ask for those sort of concessions, but obviously it's not meaning to be anything underhanded or anything in the workplace. And at your level, Saren, I think, it is quite possible when you're working, for example, with your executive colleagues around the table, that would be an opportunity where you could perhaps, use the give and take style. Dan says he's got 76% in investigation. Okay, that's all right, Dan. It's very strong, but it just means that occasionally you might find yourself come unstuck when you're working with someone that's got clearly an emotional approach, and particularly in the collaboration area. So, which is the opposite, diagonally opposite, as you can probably see on the chart. All right, so obviously you're starting to look at your profile, which is wonderful, and it does give you lots of interesting insights into how you might deal with things in more effective ways. So if we now move in and talk about each of the different styles, let's talk about these, and let me use those 4 leaders to make the point. So investigators like to marshal their facts and figures, and they tend to be assertive in terms of how they advance their argument. They'll use logic to persuade, and they'll tend to be methodical and structured in their approach. Now, Al Gore is such a person. He's the only one of those 4 people alive. So if you go onto YouTube and you have a look at his video on The Inconvenient Truth, it is just completely populated with facts and figures, charts and graphs, more charts, more figures, more graphs, more statistics. So he's trying to make a very strong case for the need to do something about climate change by using data as the way forward, which is a typical example of someone who likes to investigate. So it's probably worthwhile having a look at that. Now, you don't have to go into YouTube. You can just go onto your profile, and up on the top right, I think it's the right-hand corner, you can just click on the icon and it'll take you to a video, and you can actually have a look at him in action and see what I mean. Of course, I can't do this via the broadcast because the bandwidth isn't sufficiently large enough to do that. Now, let's look at that a little bit further. So, inquisitive investigators, if you're looking at professions in the workplace that would fit the bill quite nicely, you've obviously got people like police who will, do an investigation. They'll marshal their evidence. They'll put their evidence before a court of law, and perhaps if they're successful, they'll get a conviction for somebody. A scientist has a hypothesis, and what they attempt to do is prove that hypothesis is correct or incorrect. And so that's the way they like to influence. And of course, they are quite influential, provided, of course, their methodology is sound. So a couple of professions that are drawn to that, of course, as well. So what about, when would you use this in the workplace? Well, at your level, where workplace investigations have to occur. So, for example, there's a safety issue. So for those of you who work in the outdoors, indoor as well, but if there's an outdoor problem and it has to be investigated, you do a rigorous and thorough investigation, or you call someone in to do that. And on the basis of that report, there'd be certain recommendations that are made, perhaps to change the environment so that it's a safer environment. Or if someone's been harassed or claims to be harassed, we're liable to investigate that in some depth before we make some judgment about whether that person has in fact been harassed. So they're obvious examples of where you would use investigation as a influencing strategy. But I think where you've got large-scale change, where the initiatives, you want to take people on board with you. In other words, you want to win the hearts and minds of people. It's not that ideal. Certainly people will understand the logic of it, but they won't necessarily be completely committed to the change, because that's an emotional response, not necessarily a logical response. So you can see that if you use the wrong approach at the wrong time, you may get suboptimal results as such. So let's look at the clear calculator. Now, calculators they like to promote the positives of a proposal and highlight the weaknesses of a current position. So what they do is they talk pros and cons. And a good example of that is I walked past Harvey Norman's about 6 months ago, and we're all familiar with Harvey Norman's. I walked past and I found that there was a sign outside the door saying 40% off all laptops. I thought, wow, I wasn't planning to go into to Harvey Norman's, but on the basis and the strength of that offer, I thought I'll go in and have a look. Can't do any harm. As soon as I got through the door, and on the other side, there was another sign saying, to take advantage of this offer, you must purchase by the close of business today. So retailers are doing this all the time, and what they're trying to do is they're wedging you in a certain direction. And of course, Margaret Thatcher was a master, or well, I was going to say a mistress, but she was good at that. People were either for her or against her, and because what she used to do is talk up her reasons for whatever it was that she was doing, whether we agree or disagree with it, and she'd talk down the opposition to that to such an extent that people knew exactly where they stood. So people who like to calculate will use key performance indicators. Sarah mentioned processes before. They will very much stick to process. They will govern by process and do that very effectively. So if we look at occupations out there that might actually, people who use this on a regular basis professionally, then think about salespeople. I mentioned that before. They will offer things and try and put a deadline on that when you can take advantage of that. Financial advisors, of course, will say this is the best deal in town. You've got to take advantage of it now. And of course, animal trainers, interesting enough, do the same thing. So what they do is they usually have in a circus, for example, the trainer will have a whip in one hand and a box of treats in the other, and they'll alternate between the whip and the treats to get the animal to coax the animal to do its feats. And of course, teachers, if you think about a good teacher that you had when you're at school, I'll guarantee to you that they were probably calculators, in the sense that you knew exactly where the line in the sand was, and if you overstepped the mark, you knew what would happen. So you were under no illusion about what was expected of you in the classroom. And of course, children need clear boundaries as to what's good and what's appropriate and what's inappropriate. And a good teacher will create those boundaries, so they'll use calculation as a strategy for their pupils. So if you've got any new change in the workplace that'll affect the way employees operate, then probably a good strategy would be that you talk up the benefits of the new approach from the point of view of how the employees will benefit. So what are the advantages for the employee in taking on this new approach? And then again, equally, you'd probably talk about the disadvantages of not taking on board that new approach. So if we remain the same and don't do anything, these are the disadvantages. But on the other hand, if we decide to do this, here are some advantages. So that can be very effective when you've got new changes in the workplace that affect employees and the way they like to operate. But in situations where the direction is very vague and unclear, all right, so here's a private enterprise example, your belief that we should create a new market for a product. Now, just without any information about that, other than that, it's very hard to convince people that that's the right thing to do. They need to understand what the upside is and what the downside is. They need to be very clear about that. So what I've shared with you is the two logical approaches now. And these are the two approaches that are based on some form of logic or structure or fact. And now what I want to do is go and look at the two emotional approaches and actually have a look at the distinction between the two. So the first one we'll look at is the mindful motivator. Now, motivators will use emotion to influence rather than logic. So they're usually big picture thinkers, such as entrepreneurs, and they create the link between the cause, whatever the cause is, with a compelling vision of the future. So motivators will often have a way with words, and they can define a fairly simple and convincing vision. And that's precisely what Martin Luther King did when he gave that great speech, I Have a Dream. And when you look at that speech, and it's considered to be one of the great speeches of all time, there is absolutely no facts in that speech whatsoever. So again, you can go up and click on the icon and have a listen to that speech. It's all rhetoric, beautiful rhetoric and phrasing and timing and tugging on the heartstrings, and that's why it was such a powerful speech. And its timing, of course, was very important at the time of 1965. when civil rights was considered to be a significant issue in the United States. And it still is, of course, but at the time, Martin Luther King brought that to our consciousness. So in terms of occupations that would use this, as I said earlier, if you're an entrepreneur, then what you're trying to do is to sell a big picture, sell an idea. And what you do is you surround yourself with people that will be able to give expression to that idea. Advertising executives only have a split second to make an impression, so they can't use facts, they can't use logic, so they've got to tug at the heartstrings and look at emotion. Public relations executives and artistic directors as well will use this as an approach. So where this is very powerful, say in a local government environment, is where you're developing a new strategic direction that requires winning the hearts and minds of people. So, you know, you need to get them completely and utterly engaged in a particular course of action. Then this is ideal. They still might want the facts, but they'll also, you want to get them committed to a cause. This is going to work for you. But again, if people are unclear about the rationale of a new initiative, such as unexpected cost cutting, you know, so if our budgets have been cut, people instantly want to know how deep are the cuts, where are they, and how are they going to impact on me, which of course are all logical approaches that we need to understand first and foremost. So it's no good trying to motivate people if they want to know the facts. So you can see, again, you can use the wrong strategy and you probably won't get the results that you're looking for. And remember, your bias will very much determine which approach you'll use. Now, the final one we'll look at is the collegial collaborator. And collaborators will have a tendency to influence by using emotion. But the difference between the collaborators and the motivators is that they will persuade people by engaging and involving them in a decision. So what they do is they create great teams, because what they do is they are able to create an environment where each team member is committed to each other to a point where that's an emotional pull. And what that does, of course, is it engages the hearts and minds of people. And so Mother Teresa, of course, in her quest to alleviate poverty, would be able to influence many people to work in a voluntary capacity in the streets of Calcutta or other places around the world. She had this ability to get people to get to a common cause and work as a team. And again, you can go up to the icon up on the right-hand side, click on that, and you'll see her in one of the rare interviews that she gave, talking about her approach to leadership. So that's the 4 styles. Now, I'll just talk a little bit about the collaborators and where you find them in the world of work. Now, collaborators will have a tendency to, you know, they're people like a conductor of an orchestra. The conductor of an orchestra does not actually play a musical instrument. Their job is to collaborate, of course, with all of these artistic professionals and defer the different sections of the orchestra at different times during a piece or an ensemble. So their job was to create something, a beautiful piece of music, by deferring to different sections of the orchestra. Now, a funeral director. Now, most people aren't very fond of going to funerals. It's one of those necessary things we do. But a funeral director's got to drag a whole lot of resources together in a very short amount of time, and they have to be good at being able to collaborate. And choreographers have to put a show on, and they've got to deal with a lot of people with high egos and probably quite a high level of narcissism, and they've got to bring all that together and make the show work. So you can see that that's obviously very important to be able to collaborate with those sorts of people. So in circumstances where there is a diverse and strong views in your team, in other words, you've got a strong view one way or a strong view the other, what I suggest you do is you organise a meeting where you give both views airing. and you set some ground rules and suggest that, let's not interrupt, let's hear out the views, and then we can ask questions and all the rest. And so you put on the table the elephant in the room. You actually unearth the conflict, and you get people to talk through that issue, and hopefully they get an understanding of where the other person sits, at least, perhaps a little bit of empathy and so forth. But where it won't work is if you want people, people need to know the facts. They want to know the rationale behind a decision. It's no good trying to get everyone together and collaborate. People want the information. So, remember many years ago during the amalgamation, people were wanting facts. Which councils are going to be amalgamating? When will this take place? What's the impact of this on the organisation and so forth? And so, and I know some of your councils are de-amalgamated, so you've got a similar sort of issue. So they want to know the facts. They don't want to necessarily, work as a team yet, because they need to know what's going on first. And of course, that is a good example for your case in local government. So you can see that if you use the wrong approach at the wrong time, you're going to get a less than ideal outcome. So my point to you is that if plan A doesn't work, you try plan B, you try plan C, and you keep going until you get some sort of a response that's effective. That's the best way that you can work with this profile, not just to sort of sit there and think. I mean, certainly if you've got to write a report, for example, I would suggest to you that you have your facts in there, so you investigate. You link it to the strategic direction of the organisation and the corporate plan, which is, of course, if I link it there, it's motivation. You need to consult with people. So we ask people for their opinions and get their input. So we're now using collaboration. And you finish up your report by talking about pros and cons. So if we do this, here are the advantages. And if we don't do this, here are the disadvantages. So you can see that if you're presenting a report to a group of people, such as a group of councillors, that's highly likely to be effective, because you're actually trying to adopt all four approaches in that report. And the same goes for a presentation. If you've got to give a presentation to a body of people, the idea is to use all four. Give them the facts, get them engaged in the presentation, link it to the big picture of what the council is trying to do, and finally talk about the pros and cons. And you can't help but be influential in those sorts of circumstances. So it's good for that sort of approach. Of course, the more people you're trying to influence, the more versatile you need to be. Why? Because the more people that are in the room, or the more people that read the report, the more likely it is that you will have a variation of profiles. And if you've got a variation of profiles, then the idea is to accommodate all of those variations in your report or your presentation as such. All right, so there's a whole lot of really interesting information in the report that will assist you to start. So what I suggest you do is this page here that's in your report. What I suggest you do is you circle the scores that are relatively low, and those relatively low scores, what you try and do is build them up. So you look for opportunities in your workplace where you may be able to build up those scores. And by doing that, of course, you're becoming more flexible and more versatile and ultimately more persuasive. So that's how you can use the report to your advantage. So what I want to do now is just spend the remaining minutes, we've got about 15 minutes. I just want to talk about some tools that you can use to build these up. So here's the practical aspect of what I'm talking about. So if you're going to try to if you want to use investigation as a strategy, and those of you who of course have got a high score in investigation probably will, this will resonate with you, obviously. But for those that have got a low score in this, you might want to think about using some of these approaches. So use third-party endorsement. If there is a person in another council or even in your council that has walked the talk, who has actually been able to achieve success in a certain way, then by all means quote them and refer to them. Because by using third-party endorsement, what you're actually doing is you're using investigation, you're leveraging. So, for example, if you published a book and on the back cover you'd notice that there's a number of testimonials on most books. What those testimonials are usually of high-profile people who are saying something very positive about that person, or more likely what they've written about. And of course, if we like that person and we think what they said is very logical, then we go off and buy the book. So people, when they go for interviews, of course, will use referees to use third-party endorsements for their roles and jobs. And speaking of interviews, when we recruit people, what we use is a structured interview approach. So what we do is we ask the different people that are on the short list the same questions. So we give everyone a chance to respond, and then we give them a score. So once we've made a decision, we can then justify our selection decision based on a investigation approach. In other words, structured interviews. Surveys, of course, we're all surveyed fatigued, and probably by the time you finish this on your email, you've got another survey to complete. One of the reasons that surveys are so popular, of course, is that they are based on collecting evidence and presenting it in a way that creates a compelling argument. So surveys, if they're constructed correctly, can be a very useful investigation strategy. So, of course, organisations use, engagement surveys and the like. Now, another approach you can use is what you can see in front of you, which is a process map. So you get your team together and you talk to them about all the different steps that are involved from moving from A to B. And there's usually a whole lot of intricate steps. So you map it out and you look at your pinch points in the process and actually talk to people about what they might do at those pinch points. So we have situations where we have to make decisions. How do we go about making those decisions, and what might be some good criteria for doing that? So, if you get your team together and you use process mapping, you're actually incorporating two influencing strategies, aren't you? You're using investigation by using the process map, but by getting everybody involved in that, you're also using collaboration. So whenever you can combine a couple of these different approaches, you'll actually get even better results, because obviously you're leveraging your influencing strategies across a couple of different ways. So there's some examples of what you can do. Now, for calculation, remember, calculation is talking about pros and cons, talking up the benefits and talking down the opposition or the status quo. The most obvious way of doing that, of course, is a cost-benefit analysis. So what we tend to do is when we're putting a proposal together, say for council, here are the costs, so costs are X, and here are the benefits. Now, if the benefits outweigh the costs, then there's a compelling rationale perhaps to go down that road. On the other hand, if the costs outweigh the benefits, it's probably not likely to fly. So we use that quite a lot as a logical approach. Kurt Lewin, the famous management consultant, became very famous for drawing a line down the centre of a page, and he talked about a force field analysis where on one side we had driving forces, another side we had restraining forces. So what are all the driving forces for change, and what are all the restraining forces that mitigate against change? And the idea is to try to manipulate the driving and restraining forces. And again, if you did that with your team, you'll find that you'd be using both two methods, one's calculation and one's collaboration. It's likely to be very effective as a result of that. And the other thing I'd suggest you do is use an after-action review. So after a project's been completed, you ask 3 key questions of your team. What went well? Even if it was a disaster, something went well, I'm sure. What didn't go well? Even if it was a brilliant execution, there's always something that didn't go well. And then, of course, the final question is, what did we learn from this, or what can we apply moving forward? So by using that sort of approach, you are actually creating what we call a learning organisation. So try some of those techniques if you've got a low score in calculation, and you might find that they are very beneficial for you. Now, let's go to the emotional approaches. The motivational tools that you can use a team values charter. So get your team together, ask them 4 questions. So this is your management team. Now, of course, your council's got a set of values, but this is a separate thing. This is about how people actually engage and work together, or the choices they make about engaging and work together. So you ask 4 questions. The very first question that you ask is, if there was one value that was important to you working in this team, what would it be? Question 1. Question 2, why? Define what you mean by that. So for example, if I said respect, I might say respect means to me that my opinion is valued in this team. Question 3 is why is it important, which gives you some insight about who your leaders are, who your managers are, and what their motivations are and why they think that's important. So I might say respect's important because I want to feel as if I'm part of the team. And question 4 would be what behaviours would demonstrate that. So this is the practical execution of that value. So you can actually create a charter in your team that will bind and weld the team together. Or you can use the GROW model, which stands for goal, reality, options, and where to from here. So when someone comes to you with a problem, instead of spoon feeding them with an answer, you actually say to them, what are you trying to achieve? What's the goal here? And then the R is what's the reality? What are the things getting in the way that are stopping you? The O is what are the options that you have in order to achieve this? And the W is what next? So you actually can empower or enable that person to solve their own problems by using a series of questions in a very structured way. Storytelling is outstanding as well. So, the stories that are really effective are the ones where they are to your detriment. So where you've made a mistake and you don't want some of your team members to make a mistake, I suggest you tell them a story about what happened to you. Now, you don't have to be hugely eloquent or a Martin Luther King. Just tell them the story as it happened, and people will tend to remember stories rather than just you giving them a lecture about they need to be thorough with their investigation. Just tell them a story about when you weren't, and they'll get the message very quickly. The other thing that I think you should really incorporate, particularly in your team meetings, is good news stories. Start your meetings with a win for the week. Go around the table and ask each person to tell the rest of the team one win for the week. Now, you'll find some people struggle with this because they can't think of a win for the week, which is pretty sad. But after a while, if you implement that, you're creating an upward spiral of positivity. And as a result of an upward spiral of positivity, you're going to talk about all the problems in the meeting anyway. So why don't we just start with a positive? It's a very simple thing to implement, and I can guarantee to you it's highly effective. So there's some strategies or tools for you to extend your motivational influencing strategy. Finally, what about collaboration? Now, with collaboration, of course, you're involving the team. So when you're having a meeting, try to do less talking. Actually say to the team, look, I want us to come to a resolution about how we'll resolve this. We've got half an hour. I'd like to discuss this with you and toss around some ideas. I don't want to influence your decision, but I do want to set you a challenge that whatever we come up with, we will commit to at the end of this particular half an hour, and just let them go. So this comes from Stephen Covey's work in The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Begin with the end in mind. Giving effective feedback and asking people to give you feedback about how they achieve something is also a collaborative tool because you're collaborating with them on that. Using a problem-solving approach collectively with your team obviously involves collaboration. And using active listening and paraphrasing when people are mentioning things in meetings really does add to a collaborative team environment. So again, if you're a little low on collaboration as a strategy, then these things will benefit you greatly when you're working with one or several team members. All right, so I hope that's been useful for you. You may have some questions you might want to pose to me now, or maybe some comments and observations. So go for your life. I'm all ears, and have a think about how you might want to deal with some of those things that I've mentioned before. So the key message out of all this, while you're thinking about the questions that you want to ask, is simply this. Be flexible in the way you go about trying to persuade other people. Don't rely on one strategy, that is your preferred strategy. Try to use a variety of different approaches in different situations, and if you do that, you'll get really good results. So that's all the message that I have for you. And you know, homework, of course, is pretty straightforward. I just need you to go away. If you haven't already done so, you can go in and complete your profile. If you have completed your profile, then I guess the next step is to start exercising some of these tools that I've given you and to try to use them to your benefit and for the team's benefit as well. So you can influence upwards, you can influence your colleagues around the executive table, you can influence your immediate team as well. You can influence stakeholders, you've got to influence members of the community, you've got to influence counsellors. So there's no shortage of opportunities to use these strategies and skills, and I would very much encourage you to try different approaches. Do you have access to our self-assessment reports, and can we discuss them with you sometimes? Asked Dan. Yeah, I do, Dan. I can actually bring them up. I haven't looked at them closely, but if you wanted to go through that in greater detail with me, I'm more than happy to do that. So, you know, it's just a case of making a time, and we can, of course, do that over the phone. So there's no drama with that whatsoever. I'd encourage you to do that. But the main thing now is to get it done if it hasn't been done, and then to apply it in your day-to-day. So thanks, folks. That's pretty much it from me, unless there's any other questions, and it doesn't look as if there are. So we're done. So that's Unit 2. So we'll meet again in 2 weeks' time. And what I am proposing and hoping that you will do at this point now is to start to work on your ability to influence other people. So have a fabulous weekend, and you know, get stuck into the influencing strategies this afternoon and then and next week. So okay, Dan, no problem. That'll be fine. All the best, and I wish you have a really good weekend, and thanks very much, and goodbye.